Clara Bennett did not cry when they dragged her name through the mud. She did not cry when Charles Whitmore stood on the courthouse steps and called her a thief in front of every soul in Willow Creek. She had learned long before that summer morning that tears only gave cruel people something to enjoy. So instead, she lifted her chin, picked up the small leather satchel that held everything she owned in this world, and she walked. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called her name. And that silence, God, that silence, was the cruelest thing of all. Before we go any further, if you've ever been counted out by people who never bothered to count you in, hit that subscribe button right now and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came to Willow Creek, Montana, like a punishment. The kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin, it pressed down into your bones and stayed there, reminding every living soul that the land didn't care whether you survived or didn't. The creek itself had dropped low enough that the smooth river stones showed through the surface like the spines of buried animals. Dust rose off the main road with every wagon that passed coating the storefronts. The hitching posts, the faces of people standing in doorways with nothing better to do than watch other people's misery unfold. Clara Bennett had grown up understanding that kind of heat. Not the weather kind, the human kind. She was 27 years old, and she had been surviving other people's cruelty for most of them. She stood in the center of Willow Creek's main square on a Tuesday morning, a morning that had started like any other, with the smell of hay and coffee and horse leather, and listened while Charles Whitmore, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, destroyed what little remained of her reputation with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once faced a consequence in his life. "I trusted her," Whitmore said loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. He was standing on the wooden steps of his own supply office, one hand resting on the post like he owned the whole street. Because he did. He owned most of it. "I gave her honest work, honest pay, and this is what I get in return. $3 missing from the cash drawer. A silver pocket watch that belonged to my late father." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Gone," the crowd murmured. Heads turned toward Clara. She felt every single set of eyes land on her like stones. "I didn't take anything," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Not $1, not that watch. I have never stolen a thing in my life." Whitmore tilted his head. His expression was almost gentle, the practiced sympathy of a man who had learned that looking wounded was more powerful than looking angry. "Clara," he said quietly, "don't make this worse for yourself. Don't make this—" She stopped, breathed. "You're lying, and you know you're lying." The murmur in the crowd shifted, not toward belief in her, away from it. She recognized every face in that square. Margaret Hale, who ran the laundry, and whose daughter Clara had sat with through a fever 2 winters back. Tom Briggs, who worked the grain mill, who had eaten at the same church table as Clara a dozen times. The Alderman family who'd waved to her from their porch every Sunday morning for 3 years. Not one of them said a word. Reverend Sykes, standing near the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands, looked at the ground. That was the moment Clara understood something she had always suspected, but never fully believed until right then. That community was conditional. That belonging had always been something she was allowed to borrow, never to keep. The moment someone with money and standing pointed a finger at her every relationship she'd built, every small kindness she'd offered, every morning she'd showed up and worked and tried all of it, evaporated like rain on August pavement. "You are dismissed from your position," Whitmore continued, his voice turning businesslike now. "You will vacate the boarding room above the supply house by noon, and I will be advising the other businesses in this town." He looked around at the crowd as he said it, making sure they all understood this was as much a warning to them as a sentence for her, that they would do well to consider who they take on for employment. Clara's fingers tightened around the handle of her satchel. "You can't do that," she said. "I believe," Whitmore said pleasantly, "that I just did." He turned and walked back through the door of his office without another glance at her. Like she was already gone. Like she was already nothing. The crowd began to break apart. People turned back to their errands, their conversations, their ordinary Tuesday mornings. A few of them glanced at Clara on their way past, some with pity, a few with what she could only describe as satisfaction, and most with the carefully blank expression of people who had already decided she was someone else's problem. Margaret Hale stopped beside her for exactly one moment. "I'm sorry, Clara," she said low and quick, not looking directly at her. "But you must understand, I can't. My family depends on his grain contracts, and if he thinks we're—" "It's all right, Margaret," Clara said. It wasn't. But she said it anyway because it was easier than making the woman finish the sentence. She watched Margaret hurry away. Then she stood alone in the center of the square, in the pressing July heat, with 30 cents in her coat pocket, a satchel with a change of clothes, and a small leather Bible that had belonged to her mother, and nowhere on this earth to go. She had no family. Her mother had died when Clara was 14, and her father, a drifter who'd come through once and never looked back, had never been anything more than a name she'd been given. She had no savings to speak of. Whitmore had paid her barely enough to cover the room and board. He provided a system that had kept her employed and dependent at the same time, which she understood now too late had been entirely by design. She had worked for Charles Whitmore for 2 years. She had kept his books minded, his counter swept his floors, and made sure his supply house ran clean and orderly through 2 harsh winters and 1 flood season. She had been by any honest account an excellent employee, and none of that mattered, not one day of it. Clara walked. She didn't know where she was going. She pointed herself toward the edge of town, and she walked because standing still felt like giving the square, and everyone in it, the satisfaction of watching her collapse. She passed the livery stable, past the blacksmith's forge, past the little schoolhouse where she'd once helped the teacher sort books on a Saturday afternoon when nobody had asked her to. She kept walking until the buildings thinned out and the road turned to packed dirt, and the town sounds faded behind her. The creak of wagon wheels, the distant bark of a dog, the ordinary noise of a world going on without her. The sun was directly overhead now, and the heat was merciless. She had been walking for what felt like an hour when her legs decided they were done. Not a graceful decision. Her knees simply buckled, and she went down against a split-rail fence at the edge of a property she didn't recognize. Satchel hitting the dirt beside her, one hand catching the lowest rail just before she would have gone all the way to the ground. She sat there in the dust and the heat and the silence, and she allowed herself just for a moment to feel how tired she was. Not tired from walking, tired from years of it. Years of starting over in new places and trying to make something from nothing. Years of being looked through and looked past and looked down on, years of working twice as hard as everyone around her and being worth half as much in the eyes of the people who decided such things. Tired of hoping that this town, this job, this set of faces might be different. She did not cry. She had learned by the time she was 16 that crying accomplished nothing except exhausting you further and giving people something to point at. So she sat against the fence in the midday heat, breathing slow and deliberate, and she thought about what came next. The answer was, she had no idea. She was still working on that problem when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. Clara didn't look up at first. She was accustomed to people passing without stopping. She had given up expecting otherwise. But the hoofbeats slowed, and then they stopped, and the silence that followed had a quality to it, attentive, uncertain, that made her lift her eyes. The man sitting on the horse was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not pity, not suspicion. Something more careful than either. How was tall she could tell that, even from horseback. Dark brown hair under a weathered hat, jaw carrying a few days of shadow shoulders, broad in the way of a man who worked with his body every day and always had. His eyes from where she sat looked dark. His clothes were plain and worn, in the kind of worn that came from actual use, not from trying to look a certain way. I didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked at her the way a person looks at something they haven't decided about yet. "You all right?" he finally said. "Fine," Clara said. The word came out with more sharpness than she intended. "Just resting." He glanced at the satchel in the dirt beside her, then back at her face. "Uh-huh," he said in a tone that did not indicate belief. "I don't need help," she added. "Didn't say you did." He shifted in the saddle. Road's not a great place to rest, though. Sun like this. I'm aware of what the sun is. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Yes, ma'am. He didn't ride on. She waited for him to ride on. You headed somewhere? He asked. I'm deciding, Clara said. Deciding. That's what I said. I was quiet for another moment. Then he swung down off the horse in one easy movement and crouched down a few feet away from her, not close enough to crowd, just low enough to be at eye level. Up close, she could see that his face was older than she'd first thought, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of lines that came from being outdoors in all weather for a long time. There was a scar along his jaw, pale and old, curved like a question mark. Ethan Cole, he said. I've got a ranch about a mile back that way. He tilted his head down the road. If you need water or shade or... I don't know you, Clara said flatly. No, he agreed. You don't. Every man who offers help eventually wants something in return. He didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't give her the wounded look she expected, the performance of being insulted that men usually offered when they didn't get the gratitude they decided they were owed before they'd even asked. He just looked at her steadily and said, Then I guess I'll have to prove I'm not every man. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze without blinking, without fidgeting, without the hungry, calculating edge she'd learned to watch for in men's eyes when they thought they were offering something you needed. There was nothing in his expression except a quiet, patient sincerity that she didn't know what to do with because she hadn't encountered it very often. I was a bookkeeper, she said finally, not sure why she was saying it. For Whitmore's supply house. He dismissed me this morning and told the whole town I stole from him. Did you? The directness of it surprised a short, dry sound out of her, not quite a laugh. No. He nodded slowly. Whitmore does that, he said, and something in his voice had changed, gone flatter, quieter. To people he's done with. Clara looked at him more carefully. You know him. I know of him, Ethan said. Which was not the same thing she noted, and he clearly intended the distinction. He stood back up, brushing dust from his knee. My offer stands, ma'am. Water, shade, nothing else required. Clara sat with that for a moment. The sun pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Her throat was dry enough that swallowing took effort. The 30 cents in her pocket would not get her a room in any boarding house in Willow Creek. Not now that Whitmore had spoken, and the next town was 15 miles east on a road she'd never traveled. She picked up her satchel and stood. One night, she said. Water and shade, that's all. That's all, he agreed. She followed him back up the road without another word, and neither of them spoke during the walk, and the silence between them was unexpectedly not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had both learned somewhere along the way that filling space with noise was usually just a way of avoiding the things worth saying. The ranch came into view around a gentle bend, a low, solid house, a barn that had seen better decades but still stood straight, a corral with 3 horses moving slow in the heat, a kitchen garden along the south wall with tomatoes and beans running up their stakes. It was not a prosperous property, but it was a cared-for one. The difference was visible in the small details: the fence line repaired in mismatched wood, the barn door rehung so it sat level, the garden weeded even in the heat of July when most people let things go. Someone lived here who paid attention. Ethan led the horse to the barn and came back to find Clara standing on the porch, not having gone inside without being asked. He noticed that. She could see that he noticed. Kitchen's through there, he said, pushing the front door open. Pump's out back if you need to wash. I'll put something together to eat. You don't have to feed me, Clara said. I'm going to eat anyway, he said. Not a lot of sense in cooking for one if there's two. She couldn't argue with the logic of that, so she didn't. The inside of the house was spare, but clean. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, shelves along one wall with provisions organized with the neatness of a man who lived alone and had worked out his own system. A wool blanket folded over the back of one chair. A rifle above the door, a hat on the peg beside it. No photographs. No decoration to speak of. But no clutter either. Just a man's life stripped down to what was necessary. There was something both lonely and settled about it that Clara recognized because her own life had looked the same. She sat at the table while Ethan moved around the small kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to fending for himself. He didn't talk much, and he didn't seem to expect her to fill the silence, which was a relief. He put bread and cold beans and dried beef on the table and sat down across from her. And they ate, and it was the first meal Clara had had that day, and possibly the best one she'd had in weeks, for the simple reason that no one had put conditions on it. "How long were you at Whitmore's?" Ethan asked midway through the meal. 2 years, Clara said. "And before that, Milltown east of here. Before that, a ranch up near the border. I've been moving since I was 16. She paused. "My mother died. There wasn't anyone else." He didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded like he was filing the information away carefully. "So you know how to work." "I know how to do most things that need doing," she said. "Bookkeeping, mending, cooking, basic carpentry when it's required. I learned fast." She set her fork down. "What I don't know how to do is ranch work. Horses, cattle, any of that." He looked at her steadily. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you're going to offer me work," Clara said. "And I'd rather you know what you're getting before you do." Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, more like a careful recalibration. "What makes you think I'm going to offer you work?" "The way you looked at the garden when we came in," she said. "Like it was behind. And the fence on the north side needs at least 3 new rails. I counted them on the way past. And you're cooking for yourself with not much ease, which means either you don't enjoy it or you haven't been eating regularly." She paused. "And you said nothing else required. Which means you're a man who keeps his word. Which means what you were actually offering when you offered it was more than water and shade." The silence stretched out. "You said you were a bookkeeper," Ethan said finally. "I am," Clara said. "But I pay attention." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at something on the table rather than at her. Then he said, "I can pay you a fair wage. Room in the barn loft. I can make it decent. There's a cot up there. Works hard, and I'm not easy to talk to." "That's fine," Clara said. "I'm not looking for easy." "I don't know how long the arrangement would need to be," he said. "I can't promise anything beyond the next month." "Neither can I," she said. "So we understand each other." He put his hand out across the table. She looked at it for a moment, then shook it. His hand was calloused and warm, and he didn't grip too hard, which she noticed because men who gripped too hard were usually telling you something. "One thing," Clara said, not letting go immediately. "If you're lying to me, if any of this turns into something other than what you've said it is, I will find a way to make sure you regret it. I am very good at finding ways." He met her eyes. "I believe you," he said. She let go. That night, she lay on the cot in the barn loft, listening to the horses moving below and the sound of crickets coming through the single high window, and she ran through every possible way this situation could go wrong, because that was what she did, had always done, would probably always do, cataloged the risks before she could afford to rest. She thought about the look on Whitmore's face that morning. The almost kind "I'm terribly sorry" face he'd put on while he dismantled her life in front of an audience. She thought about the way he'd said her name. Clara. Patient and penal, and completely indifferent to whether she survived what came next. She thought about the fact that Ethan Cole had said Whitmore does that with the flat, careful voice of a man who had reason to know. She thought about the fact that nobody in Willow Creek had ever mentioned Ethan Cole to her in 2 years of living there. Not his name, not his ranch, not so much as a word about a solitary cowboy who apparently lived close enough to rides to town in under an hour. She thought about what that meant. Then she stopped thinking because her body had reached its limit, and she slept deeply without dreaming for the first time in longer than she could remember. She did not know, lying there in the quiet of that barn loft with the smell of hay and horseflesh around her, that Charles Whitmore's man had been seen on the road 2 miles east that afternoon, watching the direction she'd walked. She did not know that in Whitmore's study, that same evening over a glass of bourbon and the warm amber light of an oil lamp, the richest man in 3 counties had leaned back in his chair and said with the idle satisfaction of a man who had already won, "Find out where she landed." She did not know that Ethan Cole in the house 50 yards away had sat up past midnight in the dark, not sleeping, barely even moving, turning something over in his mind with the slow, grinding deliberation of a man who'd been living with a weight for years and had just felt it shift. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was the scratch of hay, the sound of horses, the relief of being for one night at least somewhere that nobody was asking her to leave. It was not safety. She understood that. But it was the closest thing to it she had found in a very long time, and for now, in the breathless heat of a Montana summer night, it was enough. Clara woke before the sun. That was nothing new. She had been waking before the sun since she was old enough to understand that the hours before other people stirred were the only hours that fully belonged to her. She lay on the cot in the barn loft for exactly 1 minute, listening to the horses shift below and the distant call of a meadowlark somewhere outside. And then she got up because lying still had never been something she was good at. She found a bucket near the barn door and located the pump behind the house without having to ask. She washed her face and hands in the cold water, smoothed her dress as best she could, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the early morning, taking inventory of herself, the way she always did at the start of a new situation. 2 hands, a working mind, 30 cents and a satchel. A job that might last a month, offered by a man she didn't know yet, on a ranch that needed more work than one person could manage alone. It was not a lot, but she had started with less. She went to the kitchen and built the fire in the wood stove before Ethan appeared because she had noticed the night before that the firewood was stacked near the door and the kindling was already split, which meant he had a morning routine and she intended to be useful inside of it rather than outside of it. By the time she heard his boots on the floorboards, she had water heating and the beginnings of a passable breakfast assembled from what she'd found on the shelves. He stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Clara said without turning around. "But I also didn't have to sit on a fence post in the middle of the road yesterday, and here we both are." A pause. Then quietly, almost to himself, "Fair enough." He sat at the table, and she put food in front of him and poured coffee. Real coffee, not the weak substitute stuff, and sat down across from him, and they ate in the same easy quiet they'd managed the night before. It was unusual, she thought, to find someone whose silence was comfortable rather than loaded. Most people filled silence with something small talk, nervous questions, the performance of friendliness. Ethan Cole simply existed in it, and somehow that made it easier to exist in it alongside him. "I want to be honest with you about what needs doing," he said when the coffee was half gone. "This place has been running short-staffed for 2 years. I've been managing, but just barely." "Tell me all of it," Clara said. "Not the polished version, all of it." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, not quite surprise, but close to it. Like he had expected her to ask for the easy version, and was recalibrating. Fencing on the north and west sides both need repair before winter. The barn roof has got a soft spot over the east stall that'll cave if we get a hard snow. The kitchen garden is behind where it should be for this time of year because I haven't had time to tend it properly. The horses are fine. I've kept up with them, but the tack room is a disaster, and it bothers me every time I walk in. He stopped. "And I haven't kept books in 18 months. I know what's coming in and what's going out, but I couldn't tell you the numbers if I had to." "You'd have to if you wanted credit from the bank," Clara said. "I don't go to the bank," he said flat. "I don't intend to." She filed that away. "All right. The fencing I can learn to do with guidance. The roof I'll need you to show me what to look for. The garden I can handle on my own, it's not far gone just behind. The tack room I'll sort today. And the books I can start this evening if you show me what records you have." Ethan set his coffee cup down slowly. "You're not worried about taking all that on." "I'm worried about all sorts of things," Clara said. "But not that." He nodded once, like that settled something, and pushed back from the table and reached for his hat. They went to work. She discovered quickly that ranch work used muscles she had not previously been aware of owning. Carrying fence rails was different from carrying ledger books. The tack room, which Ethan had described as a disaster with characteristic understatement, was in fact a state of organized chaos that apparently made sense only to a man who lived alone and never had to explain his system to anyone. She spent the better part of the morning reorganizing it, hanging things properly, coiling ropes and hanging them rather than piling them. And when she was done, she stood back and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of a problem solved. Ethan looked in around midday, stopped, and was quiet for a moment. "That's better," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I could have found everything before," he said, which was clearly a defensive instinct, and she recognized it for what it was. "I know," she said. "But now I can find things too. That matters if we're both working this place." He looked at her with that careful expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was deciding how much to say. "We," he said like he was testing the word. "You hired me," Clara said. "That makes it we, at least for the month." He turned and went back to the horses without responding. But she noticed just before he turned that the edge of his jaw had shifted in a way that might, on someone less guarded, have been called a smile. By the end of the first week, they had fallen into a rhythm without ever formally discussing one. Clara was up first, fire built and water on before dawn. Ethan was in the barn by the time the light came. They worked through the morning on whatever needed doing, and there was always something that needed doing, and met at midday for a meal that they took in shifts more often than not, depending on where the work stood. Afternoons were longer and harder, and by the time the light started going, they were usually both tired enough that conversation at the evening meal was brief and practical. It suited them both. She could feel that it suited them both. What she noticed in those early days was the way Ethan worked. He was methodical and thorough and physically capable in a way that made difficult things look merely effortful rather than impossible. But more than that, he worked with a kind of focus that suggested he was not thinking about anything else. Like the work itself was the point, not just a means to an end. She recognized that too, because she had learned the same habit from the same necessity, that when the world outside your hands was uncertain, the surest thing you could do was put your hands on something real and fix it. They were 3 days in when she found the ledger box under the kitchen shelf. It was a wooden crate not locked, containing a jumble of receipts, notes, and a half-started account book that petered out around November of the previous year. She spent an evening sorting through it, while Ethan sat across the table sharpening tools, and she pieced together the picture of his finances with the patience and thoroughness she'd once applied to Whitmore's much larger accounts. The picture was not dire, but it was not comfortable either. "You're operating on a thinner margin than you probably realize," she said without looking up from the page. "I figured," Ethan said. "The cattle prices last fall were bad, I know. And you had a vet cost in October that took most of your reserve." He was quiet. "You should have a reserve," Clara said. "Not just for emergencies, for the bank of time seasons when things go wrong and you need to absorb it without going under." "I know how ranching works," Ethan said. There was no heat in it, but there was a flatness that told her she'd reached the edge of something. She looked up. He was still working on the tool in his hand, not meeting her eyes. "I'm not criticizing," she said. "You've kept this place running alone for how long?" A pause. 4 years. 4 years alone," she said. "And it's still standing. That's not nothing, Ethan." He looked up then. She didn't look away. "No," he said finally. "It's not nothing." She went back to the ledger. He went back to sharpening. But something had shifted between them, small, barely perceptible, the way a door shifts when the latch finally seats properly. It was on a Thursday, the 9th day, that Hicks showed up. Clara was in the garden when she heard the horse. She straightened and looked toward the road and saw the rider coming up the property at a deliberate pace, not hurried, not friendly. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s, with a face like a used boot, and he wore his hat pulled low in a way that was either habit or affectation. He didn't stop at the fence. He came all the way to the edge of the garden before he pulled up. "You the woman they're talking about in town," he said. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and looked up at him without moving. "I imagine women get talked about in town fairly regularly. You'll need to be specific." His eyes narrowed slightly, like he'd expected something other than that. "Clara Bennett, used to work for Mr. Whitmore." "I know my own name," she said. "Who are you?" Name's Hicks. I work for Mr. Whitmore. Then we don't have any business, Clara said. I'm not on Mr. Whitmore's property. Mr. Whitmore's aware of that, Hicks said. He wanted me to pass along a message. Then pass it along and go. Hicks took a slow breath, like a man being very patient with someone he'd decided wasn't worth patience. Mr. Whitmore says you're welcome to come back to town. He says he's willing to let the matter of the missing money rest, given enough time has passed. He says he'd be willing to offer you work again, different duties, and that he'd make sure the right people in Willow Creek understood things had been resolved. Clara looked at him steadily for a long moment. He said all of that, she said. He did. Tell me something, she said. When a man publicly destroys a woman's reputation in front of an entire town, then sends one of his hands out a week later to offer her a job, what would you call that? Hicks's expression didn't change. Ma'am, I'm just delivering the message. You tell Mr. Whitmore, Clara said, that I have work, and that if he has something to say to me, he is welcome to say it to my face in public, the same way he chose to say everything else. She turned back to the garden. That may not be the smartest answer, Hicks said behind her. Mr. Whitmore's not a man who responds well to... I said what I said, Clara replied, not turning around. Goodbye, Mr. Hicks. She heard him sit there for a moment, then heard the horse turn and move away up the road. She kept her hands on the plants in front of her, checking each stem and leaf with methodical attention until the sound of hoofbeats was completely gone. Then she became aware that her hands were shaking. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from the specific controlled anger of someone who has been patient for a very long time and who is choosing deliberately not to lose that patience yet. I saw him from the barn. She turned. Ethan was standing at the edge of the garden arms, loose at his sides, watching the road where Hicks had gone. Whitmore's man, she said. I know who Hicks is. His voice was even, but the flatness in it was different from the usual flatness, heavier, more deliberate. What did he want? She told him. All of it plainly without editorializing. Ethan was quiet for a long moment after she finished. You should have gotten me, he said. I handled it, Clara said. I know you handled it, he said. That's not what I meant. I meant... He stopped, pressed his mouth together, tried again. If Whitmore's sending men out here, that's not just about you. That's about this property, too. Clara looked at him. Why would Whitmore care about your property? And there it was, again the shift, the flatness, the careful withdrawal of expression that she was learning to read, as there is something here I have not told you, and I am deciding whether to. He doesn't, Ethan said. Forget it. You should have gotten me. Ethan. He looked at her. What does Whitmore want with you? She asked quietly. For a moment, she thought he was going to turn and walk back to the barn. She could see him weighing it, could see the decision moving across his face with the slow grinding effort of a man who had spent 4 years keeping his own counsel and didn't know what it felt like to do anything else. Then he said, "Come inside." They sat at the table, the same 2 chairs, the same oil lamp burning between them, and Ethan told her what he had not told anyone in 4 years. His family had owned land outside Willow Creek for 20 years before Charles Whitmore arrived in the county. Good land, not spectacular, but solid. His parents had built the original house his father had run cattle. His mother had kept a kitchen garden, not unlike the one outside the window right now. He had grown up on that land and expected to grow old on it. Whitmore had come in quietly. That was how he worked. Ethan said, not with threats, not with obvious pressure, but with offers and opportunities and the patient incremental accumulation of leverage. He'd loaned money to struggling ranchers, accepted shares in operations, as collateral, positioned himself as a benefactor while systematically building dependency. By the time people understood what was happening, they needed him too badly to push back. Ethan's father had borrowed money from Whitmore in a bad year, a drought year that had hit the whole county hard. The loan terms had been reasonable, or had appeared to be. Whitmore had been a patient man, about the repayment, perhaps too patient. Looking back in the way that a man who intends to take the whole property rather than the debt is always patient. 3 years later. Ethan's father was dead. A riding accident. Sudden, nobody's fault. His mother had struggled through 1 year on her own, and then passed the following winter. Grief and exhaustion, and a bad chest that had never fully healed. Ethan had come back from a cattle drive to find the loan called in the terms disputed, and Whitmore's lawyer presenting paperwork that legally, technically in the fine print that neither of his parents had been able to fully parse when they'd signed, gave Whitmore claim to half the property. They fought it. Ethan had spent everything he had and everything he could borrow on a lawyer. In the end, Whitmore had taken the east portion of the property, the portion with the creek running through it, the portion with the best grazing, the portion that would have made the difference between a sustainable operation and a marginal one, and Ethan had kept this the house, the barn, the dry western pasture enough to survive on, but not enough to thrive. He had built it back slowly over 4 years, stayed quiet, kept to himself, did not go to town unless he had to, and when he did, spoke to as few people as possible. Because the alternative, the anger, the desire to make Whitmore answer for what he'd done, was something Ethan had decided very deliberately he could not afford to act on. Not because he was afraid of Whitmore, but because he had seen what happened to men who let that kind of anger run them. "I made a choice," he said, "to stay and build, not to burn." Clara had been listening without interrupting. "Now," she said, "and now Whitmore's interested in me, and that brings him to your door." "If he thinks you know something," Ethan said, "or if he thinks you're a problem he didn't fully put down, then yes, he'll look for angles." "Angles," Clara repeated. "Like using whatever connection he assumes exists between you and me to get leverage on one or both of us." "That's how he thinks," Ethan said. She sat with that for a moment. "Are you regretting taking me on?" He looked at her directly. "No." The word was simple, and it was immediate, and she believed it. "He's going to come back," she said. "Not Hicks. Whitmore himself or something official. He's not the kind of man who sends one messenger and lets it go." "No," Ethan agreed. "He's not." "Then we should be thinking about what we have," Clara said. "What ground we can stand on when he does." Ethan looked at her across the lamp. "What ground do we have?" "More than you might think," she said. "But I need access to some things. Town records, land records specifically. I need to understand exactly what that loan said, and what the transfer of property was based on, and whether it was done correctly." She paused. "You still have the paperwork?" "In a box in the bedroom," he said. "Haven't looked at it in 2 years." "I need to look at it," Clara said. "Tonight if possible." He didn't hesitate. He got up, went to the bedroom and came back with a wooden box and set it on the table between them. She opened it and began to read. It was well past midnight when she finally set the last page down and sat back and pressed her hands flat on the table and thought very carefully about what she was going to say. Ethan had stayed up with her, not watching over her shoulder, just present, sitting across the table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Waiting with that particular patience of his that she was beginning to understand was not passivity, but something else entirely. The patience of a man who had decided that whatever was in that box was either going to matter or it wasn't. And either way, the night would end and the morning would come, and waiting changed nothing. "Ethan," Clara said, "what did you find?" His voice was careful, like he was trying to hold it steady. "There is a clause in the original loan agreement," she said slowly, "about the property transfer. The transfer of the east section, the way it was executed, it required the signature of both your parents or the sole surviving heir." She looked up. "Did you sign anything when Whitmore took the property?" He stared at her. "I signed papers. I was told they were required. My lawyer at the time told me—" "What lawyer?" she said. The silence that followed had a weight to it. "Kellerman," Ethan said finally. "Out of Billings." "Did you know Whitmore before you hired Kellerman?" Another silence. Longer. "Kellerman was recommended to me," Ethan said slowly. "By the bank. By Thomas Hartley at the county bank." "And does Thomas Hartley," Clara said quietly, "have any business relationship with Charles Whitmore that you're aware of?" She watched it move across his face, the realization arriving the way these things always arrived, not like a light being switched on, but like light growing slow and certain, illuminating something that had been there all along and simply unrecognized. She watched him sit with it, watched him absorb it, watched the stillness in him become a different kind of stillness, not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of something that has been very tightly wound and is deciding whether to hold. "The lawyer was Whitmore's man," he said. Flat, not a question. "I can't prove that yet," Clara said. "But the signature on the transfer document on the line that should be yours does not look the same as your signature on the original loan agreement. Not to my eye. I've looked at a lot of signatures. I know what forgery looks like when it's done in a hurry." Ethan stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she could see from across the room that his hands had gone still against his thighs, in the deliberate way of a man who is choosing very carefully what to do with them. "4 years," he said, barely above a whisper. "I know," Clara said. "He took half my family's land with a forged signature." "That is what I believe," Clara said carefully. "I am not a lawyer. I cannot prove it without a comparison and an expert, but I believe that is what happened." He turned around. His face was, she had never seen it like this. Not angry precisely, or not only angry. It was more than that, and more complicated than that, a grief that had finally found its shape after years of not having one. "What do we do?" he said, and she realized in that moment that he was asking her. Not asking in the helpless way of someone with no options, but in the genuine way of a man who had just discovered that he was not alone in a fight he'd thought he'd lost before it began. He was asking because he trusted her judgment. Already. In 9 days. The weight of that was not lost on her. "First," she said, "we keep this between us. You don't change anything about how you behave toward anyone in town. You don't change anything about how you go about your days. If Whitmore hears so much as a rumor that we've been looking at these documents, he will move to cover himself before we have anything solid." "All right," Ethan said. "Second," she said, "I need to go to town." He looked at her sharply. "Clara, not to confront anyone," she said. "To see things. Land records are public, they're kept at the county office. I need to see whether the transfer was filed correctly and whether the filing matches what's in this box. There may be a discrepancy in the official record that we can point to." "Whitmore has people in the county office," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "So I'll need to be quick and careful." She paused. "And I'll need to look like someone who has no particular reason to be looking at land records. Someone doing ordinary business." Ethan studied her. "You've done this kind of thing before." "I've never accused a rich man of fraud, if that's what you're asking," Clara said. "But I have spent 10 years learning how powerful people arrange things on paper to look like something they're not. I know what to look for." He sat back down at the table slowly and looked at the box of papers between them. "Clara," he said, "if this goes wrong—" "I know what it means if it goes wrong," she said. "Whitmore will have us both out of this county inside of a month. You'll lose the rest of the ranch and I'll lose—" She stopped. "Well, I don't have much to lose, but you do, so I'm not going to let it go wrong." "You can't guarantee that," he said. "No," she said. "But I can be good enough that it doesn't matter." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to trust me." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Montana night was entirely still. Not even a wind, just the vast dark silence of a summer that had gone past its middle and was beginning in whatever way seasons begin, their turning to shift. "All right," Ethan said finally. "I trust you." It was 3 words, and he said them without drama, without performance, the same way he said everything directly once, meaning it completely. Clara nodded. She began restacking the papers carefully back into the box, smoothing each page, making sure each document was in exactly the order she'd found it. "One more thing," Ethan said. She looked up. "When Hicks came today," he said slowly, "and you stood there and told him to pass your answer along, were you afraid?" She considered the question seriously because he had asked it seriously. "Yes," she said. "You didn't show it." "Showing it wouldn't have helped," she said. "So I didn't." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between recognition and something softer, something she didn't yet have a name for. "Get some rest," he said finally. "We've got a long day tomorrow." She took the lamp and went back to the barn. Lying on the cot in the dark, she ran through everything she'd read in that box, organizing it in her mind the way she organized ledger columns, systematically, carefully making sure nothing was out of place or misunderstood. She went through it 3 times before she was satisfied. Then she lay still and thought about the way Ethan had said, "I trust you." It had been a long time since someone had said that to her, and meant it as something other than a prelude to disappointment. She filed that away too in a different kind of column, the one she kept for things that were real and might matter if she let them. She was still not sure yet whether she would. But she was beginning to think that on this ranch in this summer, in the middle of a fight she had stumbled into by collapsing against a fence post on a Tuesday afternoon, she might be exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not know, lying there in the still warmth of that Montana night, that 2 miles east on the main road to Willow Creek, a rider had passed through the dark going west, not toward the ranch, but carrying word of it. Carrying her name and Ethan Cole's name in the same breath to the man who had sent him. Carrying the particular dangerous news that the woman Charles Whitmore had dismissed as nothing was proving to be considerably harder to remove from the board than he had anticipated. Charles Whitmore, when the report came, did not raise his voice. He rarely did. He simply set down his glass, folded his hands on his desk, and thought for a while. Then he said to the man standing across from him, "Find me Thomas Hartley, first thing in the morning," and smiled the way a man smiles when he has not yet decided to stop being patient, but has begun making preparations for when he does. Thomas Hartley arrived at Whitmore's office at 7 in the morning, which meant he had not slept. Clara knew this because she had been in Willow Creek since before 6, moving through the early quiet of a town that was not yet fully awake, doing what she had told Ethan she would do quickly, carefully, looking like someone with no particular reason to be looking at anything. She had not told Ethan she was leaving before dawn. She had left a note on the kitchen table that said simply, "Gone to town. Back by noon. Don't send anyone after me." She had signed it with her initials because that felt more like a statement of intent than her full name, and she had walked the mile to the main road and caught a ride on a hay wagon heading east, driven by an old man named Ferris, who asked no questions and expected no conversation, which suited her completely. The county records office opened at 7:30. She knew this from her 2 years in Willow Creek, during which she had filed paperwork on Whitmore's behalf more times than she could count. She also knew that the clerk who opened on Tuesday and Thursday mornings was a young man named Albie Marsh, who was nearsighted, easily flustered, and deeply committed to the rules of proper procedure, which meant he would let her look at whatever was in the public record without asking why. Because the public record was the public record and procedure was procedure. She was at the counter when Albie unlocked the door at 7:32. "Miss Bennett," he said, blinking at her through his spectacles, with the mild alarm of someone who has encountered an unexpected variable in an otherwise predictable morning. "I didn't. That is, I heard. Are you?" "Good morning, Albie," Clara said pleasantly. "I need to look at some land transfer records. I believe you keep those in the main ledger under property filings." "I do, yes," Albie said, recovering. "Which that is what property?" "Cole Ranch," Clara said. "And the adjacent parcel that transferred to Whitmore Cattle Company roughly 4 years ago, I believe around October or November 1879. Albie blinked again. Something moved across his face, not suspicion exactly, but awareness. He knew who owned the Cole Ranch now. He knew whose name was attached to both parcels. Clara watched him work through the arithmetic of whether this was a situation that required him to consult someone before proceeding. She smiled at him, not warmly enough to be suspicious, but warmly enough to be normal. "It's a public filing, Albie." "Yes," he said. "Yes, of course it is." He brought her the ledger. She had 12 minutes before the office would begin filling with the ordinary business of the morning. She used all 12 of them. What she found was not a smoking gun. It was better than a smoking gun. It was a procedural inconsistency so subtle that only someone who had spent years handling property documents would catch it, and so consequential that once caught, it could not be uncaught. The transfer filing carried a date of November 14th, 1879. The notation in the ledger recorded the signature of Ethan Cole as authorizing heir. But the notarization stamp, the stamp that certified the signature had been witnessed and verified, bore a date of November 11th, 3 days before the document was filed. And the notary whose stamp appeared on the filing was a man named Gerard Poole, who had left Willow Creek for Denver in September of 1879, 2 months before either date on the document. A notary, who was no longer in the county, had certified a signature 3 days before the document existed. Clara read it twice slowly, making absolutely certain she was reading what she thought she was reading. Then she closed the ledger, thanked Albie Marsh with the same pleasant efficiency with which she'd arrived, and walked out of the county records office into the morning sunshine of Willow Creek's Main Street. She allowed herself exactly 5 seconds to feel the particular electric satisfaction of having found the thing she went looking for. Then she looked up and saw Thomas Hartley walking fast toward Whitmore's office on the far end of the street, and understood immediately that her window was closing. She did not run. Running attracted attention. She walked with the measured, purposeful stride of a woman who had somewhere to be and knew exactly where it was, cutting across the street and down the side lane that would take her to the edge of town without passing in front of Whitmore's office. And she did not look back, and she did not slow down until the buildings were behind her and the road opened up toward the ranch. She was back before 10. Ethan was in the corral when she came up the road. He saw her and went still, and she could tell from 30 yards that he had been worried, and she could also tell that he was not going to say so, because saying so would require admitting it, and he was not quite there yet. He opened the corral gate and came to meet her at the fence line. "Well," he said, "the notary who certified your signature on the transfer document left the county 2 months before the document was dated," Clara said. "And his stamp is dated 3 days before the filing itself. The whole thing was fabricated after the fact." Ethan stood very still. "That's enough to challenge it," Clara continued. "Not enough to win on its own. We'd need a lawyer willing to take it on, and we'd need to move before Whitmore has any reason to expect we're looking. But it's a real crack in the foundation, Ethan. It's not nothing." "It's not nothing," he repeated in a voice she couldn't fully read. "It's a lot," she said quietly. "What he did to your family. What he took. It's documented, and it's challengeable, and—" "Clara!" He said her name with a strange, controlled stillness. "Hartley was there this morning." She stopped. "You saw him?" "I rode past the North Road about an hour ago. Saw a man moving fast toward town who I recognized." He looked at her steadily. "Which means Whitmore's already making moves. Which means he may already know you've been asking questions." "I was careful," Clara said. "You were," he said. "But Albie Marsh is a 20-year-old boy whose father works for Whitmore's grain supplier, and the county records office has 3 windows facing the street." He paused. "I'm not saying you did anything wrong. I'm saying we may have less time than we thought." Clara absorbed that. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she also knew that knowing it didn't change what she'd found or what it meant. It only changed the speed at which they needed to move. "Then we need a lawyer," she said. "Someone outside Whitmore's reach. Someone from Billings or Helena, not anyone local." "That takes money," Ethan said. "I know. And time to get word out and have someone ride down." "I know that too." They looked at each other across the fence for a moment, both of them doing the same mental calculation, both of them arriving at the same answer at approximately the same time. 3 days, Ethan said. "Maybe 4, if I send a wire today." "Send it from the telegraph office in Miller's Crossing," Clara said, "not Willow Creek." His jaw tightened. "That's 15 miles. "Yes," she said. "But Whitmore doesn't own anyone in Miller's Crossing." He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave one short nod. "I'll go this afternoon," she breathed. "All right. And until then nothing changes. Same routine, same everything." "Same everything," he agreed. He turned back toward the corral, then stopped with his hand on the gatepost, not looking at her. "Clara." "What?" "You walked back from town." "I did." A pause. "That's a mile." "I'm aware," she said. He turned his head just enough for her to see the edge of his profile. Next time, he said take the horse. It was a small thing. A practical thing. She filed it next to all the other small practical things he'd offered her over the past 10 days that added up collectively to something she didn't quite have a word for yet. Next time, she said, I will. He went back into the corral, and she went inside, and neither of them said anything else about it, and the morning continued. The afternoon that Ethan rode to Miller's Crossing was the longest afternoon Clara had spent since she'd sat in a lawyer's waiting room at 16 after her mother died and waited to be told there was nothing. She kept herself occupied. Garden, a loose board on the porch she'd been meaning to address, but under all of it was the particular humming alertness of someone waiting for a threat to materialize and not knowing from which direction it would come. It came from a direction she hadn't expected. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Margaret Hale appeared at the end of the property road on foot, moving with the brisk, determined step of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before the doubt catches up. Clara saw her from the porch and stood up from where she'd been working on the board. She did not move toward the fence. She waited. Margaret came to the gate and stopped and looked at Clara and had the decency to look genuinely uncomfortable. I know you didn't steal from him, Margaret said without preamble. I knew it when he said it. I want you to know that I knew. Clara looked at her for a moment. But you didn't say anything. No, Margaret said. I didn't. Because of the grain contracts. Margaret's face did something complicated. Because of more than that. Because there are 6 families whose livelihood depends on Whitmore's goodwill in this valley, and I have children, Clara, and I can't. She stopped. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm telling you that I knew and I stayed silent, and I have not slept well since. Clara came down off the porch and walked to the fence. She and Margaret stood on opposite sides of it and looked at each other. Why are you telling me now? Clara said. Because I heard something this morning, Margaret said lower. Thomas Hartley was at Whitmore's office for 2 hours. I don't know what they talked about. But afterward, Hartley went to see Reverend Sykes, and Whitmore's foreman went to see the sheriff. She paused. Something's being arranged, Clara. I don't know what exactly. But whatever you're doing out here, whatever you and Ethan Cole are doing, I think you need to be careful. Clara held her expression steady. What makes you think we're doing anything? Because you're you, Margaret said simply. And because Albie Marsh told his mother you'd been looking at land records this morning, and his mother told half the laundry clientele by 10 o'clock. She met Clara's eyes. I'm sorry. I should have spoken up on the square. I know that. I'm trying to make some small part of it right now. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the grain contracts, and the 6 families, and the children, and all the ways fear made ordinary people do the wrong thing, and then live with the weight of it after. She thought about how easy it was from the outside to call that cowardice, and how complicated it looked from the inside. Thank you for coming, Clara said. I mean that. Margaret nodded quickly like someone accepting a grace she doesn't feel she deserves. Be careful, she said again. Please. She walked back up the road fast, like she wanted to be gone before she lost her nerve, or changed her mind, and Clara watched her go, and then turned and went back to the porch board and the waiting. Ethan came back at dusk. He dismounted and led the horse to the barn, and came to find her in the kitchen, where she had supper on the table and a lamp lit, and he sat down and looked at the food, and then at her. Wires sent, he said. Lawyer's name is Robert Crane, out of Helena. He has a reputation for land cases. The telegraph man said he'd have an answer by tomorrow. Good, Clara said. He picked up his fork, put it down. Margaret Hale came here. Clara looked up. You saw her. I saw her leave when I was coming back across the North Ridge, he said. I saw her from a distance. I recognized her walk. He looked at Clara steadily. What did she want? Clara told him. All of it, including the part about Hartley and the sheriff and the thing being arranged that neither of them fully understood yet. Ethan ate through most of this without comment, chewing slowly, his eyes somewhere on the middle distance. When she finished, he set his fork down and folded his hands on the table. They're going to try to move on us legally, he said, before we can move on them. That's my read, Clara said. If Whitmore knows we've been looking at the records, and I think by now he knows then, he understands we have something. He won't wait for us to use it. He'll try to create a new legal situation that makes it irrelevant. What kind of legal situation? I don't know yet, she said. It depends on what leverage he thinks he has. She paused. Ethan, is there anything, any part of the business, any arrangement you've made, anything on paper that Whitmore could use to claim a stake or a debt? He shook his head slowly. I've been careful about that. I don't borrow from anyone connected to him. I deal in cash where I can. And the property itself. The deed you have, the clean deed to this portion. Locked box, bedroom, second drawer. Get it out, she said. Tonight, I want to see it. And I want to make a copy of it, and the key documents from the other box, and keep the copies somewhere that isn't this house. He looked at her. You think they'd come for the papers? I think Charles Whitmore did not get where he is by leaving loose ends, she said. And right now, we are a loose end. He stood up, went to the bedroom, and came back with two things. The deed box and something she hadn't seen before, a leather document wallet, old and worn, tied with cord. He set them both on the table. The wallet was my father's, he said. It has the original loan agreement, the one that started all of this. You've been keeping it, she said. I didn't know why, he said. I couldn't throw it away. Clara reached across the table and touched the cord of the wallet gently with the tip of one finger, like she understood what it had cost him to keep it all these years. Because she did understand. Keeping something painful was its own kind of hope. The hope that someday it would matter. That someday the record of what was done to you would be worth something to someone. It matters now, she said quietly. He sat back down. They spread the documents across the table and worked through them together. Clara noting, organizing, setting out what they had and what it showed and what a lawyer would need. Ethan answering her questions, steadily filling in the history. His voice flat and even in the way it always was when he was talking about things that cost him. At some point past midnight, Ethan said, I never thought someone would sit across this table and help me fight this. Clara looked up from the page in her hand. You never asked anyone? No, he said. I didn't know how. She looked at him for a moment. His face in the lamplight was tired and open in a way it rarely was. During the day, the particular openness of people, late at night when the performance of composure gets too heavy to maintain. I didn't know how to let anyone help me either, she said. For a long time. What changed? She thought about the fence post. The Tuesday morning. The silence of the whole town turning away. She thought about the specific bracing shock of someone stopping when she'd expected no one to stop. Someone proved it was worth the risk, she said, showing up when they didn't have to. He held her gaze across the documents and the lamplight and the late-night quiet of the ranch house, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence was the kind that held something in it, something that was still forming, still finding its shape, still too new to name. Then a horse screamed. Not a whinny, not a protest. A full, terrified, ear-splitting scream from the direction of the barn. Ethan was on his feet and across the kitchen before Clara had fully processed the sound. She was 3 steps behind him, snatching the lamp off the table. He yanked the front door open, and she saw it over his shoulder. The orange flicker at the base of the barn wall, low and fast and alive. The way fire is always alive, the way it seems to move with intention. The horses, Ethan said, and he was already running. Ethan. But he was gone into the dark toward the barn, and Clara stood on the porch for exactly 1 second, in which she made a calculation about risk and priority, and what could be saved and what couldn't, and then she ran after him. He had the barn door open by the time she got there. Smoke was coming from the south-facing wall, low and thick, and the horses were in full panic. She could hear them slamming against their stall doors, the whites of their eyes visible in the dim. Ethan went straight for the first stall, working the bolt with hands that were steady, despite everything, talking to the horse the whole time. Low, constant. The specific calm of a man who understood that animals in panic needed a voice more than they needed anything else. Take the bay, he said. Second stall. Just open the door and step back. Clara found the second stall by feel and sound, and swung the bolt and got herself clear as the horse came out, and Ethan had the first one out and moving, and they got all 3 horses through the barn door and into the open corral in under 3 minutes that felt like 30. The fire was small. Whoever had set it had done it in a hurry, or had been interrupted, or had intended it as a warning rather than a destruction. The wall boards had caught but not deeply, and the dry summer heat had not yet pushed it past the first layer. Ethan and Clara beat it down with wet feed sacks working side by side without speaking, and it was out within 15 minutes, and they stood in the dark with scorched hands and smoke in their lungs and looked at each other. "That wasn't an accident," Clara said. "No," Ethan said. "They wanted us to know they can reach us." "Yes." She looked at the wall, then at him. "Are you all right?" He looked at his hands. "Fine." Then he looked back at her. "You?" "Fine," she said. They stood there in the dark for a moment in the aftermath of it. Adrenaline still moving through them, the horses still unsettled in the corral, the smell of smoke hanging in the July night. Then Ethan said very quietly, "I'm done waiting." She looked at him. 4 years, he said. "I've been careful and quiet and patient, and I've stayed small and let him have what he took and built what I could with what was left." He lifted his eyes to hers. "He just set fire to my barn, Clara." "I know," she said. "I'm done letting him decide the shape of my life," Ethan said. "Whatever it takes, whatever risk, I'm done." She held his gaze in the dark, and she felt in that moment the full weight of what he was saying. Not just about the land, not just about the fraud and the papers and the legal fight. He was saying it about all of it. About all the things a man surrenders when he decides that survival is the same as living, and the moment when he stops being able to pretend it is. "Then we fight," she said. "Properly, with everything we have." "Together," he said. And it was not a question. "Together," she said. They secured the horses and went back inside, and the lawyer's reply was waiting in Miller's Crossing. The next morning, Robert Crane out of Helena would ride down within 4 days if they would have him. They sent word back, "Come." But that same morning, before the sun had fully risen over the eastern hills, Sheriff Dale Patterson rode up the property road on his gray horse with a folded paper in his hand and a look on his face that combined genuine discomfort with the professional blankness of a man carrying out orders he had decided to stop questioning. He tied his horse at the fence and came to the porch and took off his hat, and he had the decency to look at Ethan directly when he said it. "I've got a court order here," he said, "signed by Judge Carpenter this morning. It's a claim of outstanding debt. Whitmore Cattle Company is alleging an unpaid obligation of $412 against this property with interest." He paused. "There's a lien being placed on the deed pending a hearing." The silence that followed was absolute. "There is no debt," Ethan said. Each word measured out like something he was being careful not to break. "I know that's your position," Patterson said. He looked genuinely sorry, which didn't help anything. "The claim is filed, though. That means the property can't be sold or transferred until the hearing, and if the judgment goes against you." He stopped. "The property reverts," Clara said from just behind Ethan's shoulder. Her voice was completely steady. Patterson looked at her. Something moved across his face. Recognition, or maybe something closer to guilt. He had been standing in the town square the morning Whitmore called her a thief. She knew he remembered it. She knew he knew she remembered it. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "That's right." "When's the hearing?" Ethan said. 2 weeks, Patterson said. "August the 4th. Ethan took the paper. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at Patterson, and something in his expression made the sheriff drop his gaze first. "Dale," Ethan said, "you and I have known each other 12 years. "Yes," Patterson said. "Is there anything on this document you believe is true?" Patterson put his hat back on. "I'm the sheriff," he said. "I serve what's filed." He gathered his reins. "I'm sorry, Ethan." He rode away without looking back. Ethan stood on the porch with the court order in his hand, and Clara stood beside him, and they were both very still, and the morning was already hot, and the smoke smell from the barn was still faint in the air. 2 weeks, Clara said. 2 weeks, he said. Then Robert Crane needs to be here in 3 days, she said. Not 4. Ethan was already moving toward the horse. They had found the crack in Whitmore's foundation. They had the documents. They had a lawyer coming. They had each other and the particular clarifying focus that comes when a threat becomes concrete enough to fight directly. What they did not have, what they would not have, for another 18 hours, when a letter arrived by Ryder from Miller's Crossing, tucked inside Crane's confirmation note, was the piece of information that changed everything they thought they understood about why Charles Whitmore had wanted this particular ranch so badly and for so long and with such patience. Ethan read it standing in the yard, and the paper went still in his hands, and his face did something she had never seen it do before. She crossed the yard and took the letter from his hand and read it herself, and understood for the first time that this was not just about land. It had never been about land. The letter was from a mining surveyor named James Pullman out of Helena. Crane had enclosed it with a note that said, "Only, read this before we meet. It changes the scope of what you're dealing with." Clara read it twice, standing in the yard with the afternoon sun on her back, and then she handed it back to Ethan and watched him read it again, and she waited while he finished and lowered the paper and stared at the fence line for a long moment, with the particular stillness of a man who has just had the ground shift under him in a way that requires complete recalibration. The letter said this 6 months prior. A geological survey commissioned by the Montana Territorial Railroad had identified a significant coal seam running beneath the western portion of Willow Creek Valley. The seam was deep enough to require serious capital to access, but large enough to make that capital worthwhile, more than worthwhile. The survey had been conducted quietly, as these things always were, before the information could drive up land prices. The railroad's land acquisition team had already begun moving through the county, approaching landowners, through intermediaries, purchasing options on properties that sat above the seam's path. The coal ranch sat directly above the richest portion of it. Ethan set the letter down on the porch railing and did not move for a full 30 seconds. "He's known," Ethan said finally. "Whitmore's known about the coal. Long enough to plan around it," Clara said. "Long enough to take your family's land 4 years ago and hold it, and now he's coming for the rest of it before the railroad makes the survey public and the prices go up." "The fake debt," Ethan said. "The lien on the deed. He doesn't want to buy me out. He wants to force a judgment that transfers the property for pennies." His jaw was tight. "Because if I know the coal is there, I won't sell for anything less than it's worth. But if I lose it in a fraudulent hearing, he gets it for the cost of a crooked judge," Clara finished. Ethan picked the letter up again, set it back down. His hands were very controlled, which she had come to understand meant he was feeling something too large to let move freely. "How long do we have?" he said. "The hearing is August 4th, Clara said. "That's 12 days. Crane will be here in 3. That gives us 9 days to build a case that can't be dismissed before a judge who may already be in Whitmore's pocket." She paused. "And we have to do it without tipping Whitmore to the fact that we know about the coal. Because the moment he knows we know, he will move faster than any court can stop him." Ethan looked at her. "Can we do that?" She held his gaze. She did not say, "I don't know," even though she didn't know. She said, "We have more than he thinks we have. We have the notary discrepancy. We have the original loan documents. We have Crane, who knows land fraud cases in this territory. And we have the coal survey now, which means we understand his motive, and motive changes how a judge reads everything else." "If the judge is clean," Ethan said. "If the judge is clean," she agreed. Neither of them said what happened if he wasn't. They went inside and spread everything across the table again. The loan documents, the deed, the copied notations from the county record, Pullman's letter, Crane's note, and they worked through it the way they'd been working through everything together, side by side, and methodical. And Clara wrote out a summary in her clearest hand of what they had, what it showed, and what questions Crane would need to answer when he arrived. It was full dark by the time she finished the last page and set the pen down. Ethan across the table looked at the stack of papers she'd produced and said, "You did all of that from memory." "I've been keeping it organized in my head," she said. "I find it easier than looking at the pages every time. The pages can be taken." Howe was quiet for a moment. "Clara, what Whitmore said about you in the square that you stole from him." He said it carefully, like he'd been holding it at arm's length for a while and had decided it was time to look at it directly. Did he know when he said it that you'd been looking at his accounts? Is that why he moved when he did? She had thought about this. She had thought about it on the road back from town the morning she'd gone to the records office, and she had thought about it on the cot in the barn at night, and she had not quite been ready to say it out loud, because saying it out loud meant acknowledging something that made her feel simultaneously stupid and furious. "I think so," she said. "I found an inconsistency in his supply accounts about 2 weeks before he dismissed me. I didn't do anything with it. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, and I wasn't sure it was my business. But I asked him a question about one of the entries, a specific question, one that would have told him I'd been paying attention." She paused. "I think that was enough." "He fired you to protect himself," Ethan said, "before you could figure out what you'd found, and destroyed my reputation in the process," she said, "so that if I ever did say anything, I'd already be established as a thief and a liar. No one would believe me." She looked at the table. "He's very good at what he does." "He's careful," Ethan said. "Careful and patient and smart." He said it without admiration, with the flat acknowledgement of someone who has studied an adversary long enough to respect their capabilities while hating what those capabilities have been used for. "So are we?" Clara said. He looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said, "we are." Robert Crane arrived on a Thursday afternoon riding a roan horse and carrying a leather satchel that looked like it had seen the inside of more county courthouses than most judges. He was 50 lean, with sharp gray eyes, and the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that displaying urgency was usually a negotiating disadvantage. He shook Ethan's hand and nodded to Clara and sat at the kitchen table and opened the satchel and said, "Show me everything." They showed him everything. He read for 2 hours without speaking. Clara refreshed the coffee twice. Ethan sat with the particular taut stillness of someone trying not to watch a doctor read test results. Crane made small marks in a notebook with a stub of pencil turned pages. Slowly, occasionally went back to reread something and gave no indication of his conclusions until he closed the last document and set his notebook flat on the table and looked at them both. "The notary discrepancy is real, and it's significant," he said. "A notary who'd left the county 2 months prior certifying a document dated after his departure, that's not paperwork sloppiness. That's fabrication. A competent judge will see that immediately." "And an incompetent judge," Ethan said. "We'll come to that," Crane said. "The forged signature is harder because we'd need a document examiner to testify, and that takes time we don't have before the 4th. But the notary issue alone is enough to challenge the original transfer's validity, which means the subsequent lien Whitmore just filed is built on a foundation that can be knocked over." He tapped the table. "The Cole survey complicates things interestingly." "How so?" Clara said. "Because it establishes motive with a dollar figure attached," Crane said. "Whitmore isn't stealing a piece of agricultural land. He's stealing what could be one of the most valuable mineral rights in the territory. That changes from a local property dispute to something a territorial court would take seriously, and something that, if handled correctly, a newspaper editor in Helena would take very seriously." The word newspaper landed on the table like a stone in water. Clara and Ethan looked at each other. "You're suggesting we go public," Ethan said. "I'm suggesting that a man with Whitmore's resources can influence a local judge," Crane said bluntly. "He can't influence a territorial court and a Helena newspaper simultaneously. Public attention is the one thing he can't buy silence around fast enough." He paused. "It's a risk. Once you go public, you lose control of the story. But right now, you're fighting him on ground he's had years to prepare. Going public moves the fight to ground he hasn't prepared." "He'll retaliate," Clara said. "Immediately and hard," Crane agreed. "Which is why the sequence matters. We file the legal challenge first the moment I can have the documents prepared, which is tomorrow morning. We use the challenge to force a continuance on the hearing, buy ourselves time. And then," he looked at Clara, "you said you worked his accounts for 2 years. "I did," she said. "The inconsistency you found before he dismissed you," Crane said. "Can you reconstruct what it was?" She had been waiting for this question. She had known somewhere in the back of her careful, organized mind that this question was coming. She had been building the answer to it for 2 weeks quietly from memory. The way she built ledger columns in her head, entry by entry, balance by balance, patient and exact. "I can do more than reconstruct it," she said. "I kept copies." Both men looked at her. "When I found the inconsistency," she said, "I didn't know what I had, but I've always kept copies of unusual entries. It was a habit I developed at the mill town, where the foreman had a tendency to adjust records after the fact, and then claimed the first version never existed. I copied 3 pages of Whitmore's supply accounts into my own notebook." She paused. "The notebook is in my satchel." Ethan stared at her. "You've had that the whole time. I didn't know it was relevant until the coal survey," she said. "I thought it was a supply discrepancy, looking at it now, knowing what I know." She went to the satchel, took out a small notebook worn soft with handling, and opened it to a marked page. He was receiving payments from an intermediary company called Western Land Partners. They weren't in any of his declared accounts. The payments were coming in as supply credits and being moved out within 30 days to I didn't know where. "I know now." She set the notebook on the table. Crane looked at the page. His eyes sharpened. "Western Land Partners," he said slowly, "is the front company the railroad is using for its land acquisition in this territory." He looked up at her. "You didn't know that?" "No," Clara said. "I found it in Pullman's letter. He listed the intermediaries the railroad has been using." "So Whitmore," Crane said with the deliberate, careful tone of a man building an argument as he speaks it, "has been receiving payments from the railroad's land acquisition front company, while simultaneously using fraudulent legal mechanisms to seize land the railroad wants, which he then intends to sell to the railroad at a significant profit." He set the notebook down. "That's not local fraud. That is a criminal conspiracy involving a territorial railroad, which means it falls under federal jurisdiction. Which means it is entirely outside the reach of every judge, sheriff, and county official in Willow Creek." The kitchen was very quiet. Then Ethan said with a calmness that Clara recognized as the specific calmness of someone who has been angry for a very long time and has just found the door out of it. "He's been working with the railroad the whole time." "While presenting himself as the valley's most important independent landholder," Crane said. "Yes, that's the picture." Clara looked at the notebook and the letters and the 4 years of documents spread across the table and thought about the Tuesday morning in the square and the crowd's faces, and Margaret Hale looking at the ground, and the 30 cents in her pocket, and the long walk to the fence post where Ethan Cole had stopped when he didn't have to. She thought about how close she had come to not being here, to walking 15 miles east to the next town and starting over again smaller than before. She thought about what would have happened to this ranch, to the coal beneath it, to the land Ethan's parents had built if she had kept walking. "When do we file?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Crane said. "First light. And I want both of you in Miller's Crossing when I do it, because I won't file in Willow Creek and give Whitmore 20 minutes warning." "We'll be there," Ethan said. Crane gathered the documents into his satchel with the brisk efficiency of a man who had shifted from assessment to action. "One more thing," he said. "Is there anyone in this valley, anyone whose word carries weight, who is not in Whitmore's debt and who has first-hand knowledge of his business practices?" Clara thought of Margaret Hale standing at the fence, the genuine discomfort on her face, the sleepless nights she'd admitted to. She thought of Albie Marsh at the records counter, who followed the rules of procedure even when it made the powerful uncomfortable. She thought of old Ferris on the hay wagon, who had asked no questions and expected no favors. "There may be," she said. "Give me a day." Crane looked at her for a moment with his sharp gray eyes. "You're the one who found the notary discrepancy," he said. "You're the one who kept the notebook. You're the one who put the coal survey together with the account records." He paused. "You know that your testimony is going to be central to this case." "I know," she said. "Whitmore will attack your credibility the moment you take the stand," Crane said. "He's already established you publicly as a thief. He will be thorough, and he will be brutal, and he will use every resource he has to make a courtroom believe that nothing you say can be trusted." "I know that too," Clara said. And the documents don't lie," she said. "I do. He does. The notary's departure date doesn't. The payment records don't. The surveyor's report doesn't. I'm not asking a judge to believe me instead of Whitmore. I'm asking a judge to read what's in front of him." She paused. "That's a different argument." Crane studied her for another moment. Then he nodded once with something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has worked enough losing cases to recognize when he might be standing in front of a winning one. "Get some sleep," he said. "Both of you. Tomorrow's a long day." I took the spare room Ethan had prepared, and the house went quiet, and Clara and Ethan sat at the cleared table for a moment in the lamplight, not quite ready to end the evening yet. "You kept the notebook," Ethan said. "Not an accusation, something softer than that." "I always keep copies," Clara said. "Of everything. Of things that seem wrong," she said. "It's a habit." I was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one where he was feeling something he hadn't yet found the words for and was deciding whether to try. She had learned not to push it. He always got there eventually. "Clara," he said. "Yes. When this is over." He stopped. Started again. "When the hearing is done and Crane has filed and whatever happens, happens." Another stop. He pressed his mouth flat and looked at the table and then looked back at her. "I don't want you to leave." She was quiet. "I know that's not a simple thing to say," he said. "And I know I've got no right to ask it before we're through this. But I wanted you to know before tomorrow in case—" He didn't finish that sentence either, but she heard the "in case," and she understood it, and she was not going to make him say the version of it that lived at the end of "in case." "I'm not leaving Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "Not because of the case," she said. "I'm not leaving because I don't want to." She paused. "That's a different thing than staying because I have nowhere else to go. I want to be clear about that." The distinction mattered. She could see that it mattered to him, could see it in the way something eased in his face, something that had been held careful and braced. "All right," he said, quietly. "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed," she said. They went to their separate beds, and Clara lay on the cot in the loft, and thought about tomorrow, and what came after it, and all the ways it could go right, and all the ways it could go wrong. And underneath all of that thought, running quiet and steady, like water under summer ground, was the knowledge of what Ethan had said, and what she had said back, and the particular careful warmth of it. She slept better than she expected to. They were in Miller's Crossing before the sun was fully up, all three of them. Crane with his satchel and his notebook, and the brisk forward momentum of a man executing a plan. Clara with the original documents and her copied notebook. Ethan on his gray horse with a face so controlled it was almost blank. Crane filed the legal challenge to the property transfer at 8:45 in the morning. He filed simultaneously the request for a continuance on the fraudulent debt hearing, citing the outstanding challenge to the foundational transfer. He sent a copy by wire to the territorial court in Helena flagged as a federal land fraud case. He sent a second wire to a newspaper editor named Harris in Helena, whom he described as someone who understood the difference between a story and a lawsuit, and was careful enough to treat them separately. They were back on the road to Willow Creek by 10. They were halfway home when Ethan said, "Whitmore already knows." He said it flatly without drama, the way he said things that were simply true. "How?" Clara said. "Because he always knows," Ethan said. "He has people in Miller's Crossing. He has people everywhere. The question isn't whether he knows. The question is what he does next." "He'll go to the judge," Crane said. "Try to get the continuance denied. Try to push the hearing forward rather than back." "Can he?" "He can try," Crane said. "Carpenter may go along, but the federal filing complicates it. Carpenter doesn't have jurisdiction to override a federal flag, and Whitmore's lawyer will know that. It creates delay, which is what we need." They rode in silence for a while. The road was familiar to Clara. Now she'd walked it and ridden it enough times in the past 2 weeks that she knew its rhythms, where it curved and where it straightened, and where the dust was worst. It felt, she thought, like knowing a road home. She didn't say that, but she thought it. They were within a quarter-mile of the ranch when they saw the horses at the gate. 3 of them. And the man standing on the porch, who was not waiting for the door to be answered, but simply standing there with the ownership ease of someone who has decided that formality is no longer required. Charles Whitmore. How was in his 60s, heavier than his bearing suggested, with white hair, and a face that had settled into the particular set of a man who had spent decades having people agree with him. He wore a dark coat despite the heat. He held his hat in his hands with the gesture of social courtesy, which Clara recognized immediately as theater, the same theater as the "I'm so terribly sorry" Clara face he'd worn in the square. He watched them ride up without moving. His eyes went to Crane first, taking in the satchel, the traveling clothes, the professional bearing, and then to Ethan, and then to Clara. And when they landed on Clara, they stayed, and the expression in them was not anger. It was something colder and more patient than anger. "Ethan," he said, "it's been a while." "Charles," Ethan said. He did not dismount. "I heard you had a lawyer coming down from Helena," Whitmore said pleasantly. "I thought we might save everyone some time and have a conversation first." "Whatever you have to say to my client," Crane said from horseback, "you can say through legal counsel." Whitmore's eyes moved to him. "And you are?" "Robert Crane," he said. "Helena, I represent Mr. Cole." "Mr. Crane." Whitmore nodded with the manner of a man cataloging someone for future reference. "I'm familiar with your work. You have a good record." He paused. "In the cases you've won." The implication sat in the air for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore," Clara said. He turned to look at her, and she had the full weight of his attention. Then the flat assessing attention of a man deciding how much of a problem she was. She had been afraid of this moment. She had known it would come, and she had rehearsed it in her head, and the reality of it was different from the rehearsal, the way reality always is, heavier, more immediate. The air between them charged with the specific tension of two people who both know exactly what the stakes are and who are watching each other know it. She did not let him see the fear. "The notary who certified the Cole property transfer," she said in a voice that was completely level, "left this county in September of 1879. The transfer document is dated November of 1879. His stamp certifying your signature predates the document by 3 days." She paused. "We filed on that this morning." Something moved in Whitmore's face. Not surprise, he was past surprise. It was the controlled adjustment of a man recalculating in real time. "You've been a busy woman," he said. "I've been a thorough one," she said. "There's a difference." "You know," he said with the tone of someone who has decided to be conversational. "I did you a kindness in a way when I gave you that job 2 years ago. A woman with your background, your circumstances, options are limited. I offered you something real. You offered me a wage designed to keep me dependent," she said. "And when I started paying attention to things you didn't want paid attention to, you destroyed my name in front of the whole town." She looked at him steadily. "I don't experience that as a kindness." "You should be careful," Whitmore said, "about what you think you found and what you're prepared to say in court. A young woman with a theft accusation on her record, making claims against a man who has built this community for 30 years. Is backed by documentation," Crane said. "Filed this morning with the territorial court, federal jurisdiction, which means your relationship with Judge Carpenter is not especially relevant." Whitmore looked at Crane for a long moment. Then he put his hat on. "I see," he said quietly. "Mr. Whitmore," Ethan said. He had not spoken since they arrived. His voice was the voice she recognized from the middle of the night in the barn, controlled, deliberate, finished with patience. "You took my family's land with a forged document. You've spent 4 years holding it while you waited for the railroad survey to make it worth 10 times what you stole it for. And now you're on my porch." He looked at him from horseback with the calm, direct gaze of a man who has decided that he is not afraid of this anymore. "You should go." Whitmore held Ethan's gaze. Two men knowing each other across 4 years and a great deal of loss and all the things that sat between them, like unpaid debts. Then Whitmore stepped down off the porch. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not. We'll finish it in court." Whitmore mounted his horse and his 2 men with him, and they rode back up the road without hurry, because hurry would have suggested urgency, and Whitmore did not permit himself urgency in public. Clara watched him go. She stood at the fence and watched until he was out of sight, And then she turned and found Ethan watching her. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about it honestly. Her hands were not shaking this time. "Yes," she said. "I am." Something in his face settled like a question answered. Crane was already off his horse and moving toward the porch with his satchel open. "We have 9 days," he said. "Let's not waste them." They didn't. The days that followed were the most concentrated work of Clara's life, and she had worked hard in a great many places. She and Crane built the case document by document, argument by argument, anticipating Whitmore's counter-arguments and building the answers to them before the counter-arguments were made. Ethan rode to 3 neighboring ranches and came back with 2 men older ranchers, both of whom had lost land or credit to Whitmore over the years, in patterns that looked held next to what Clara had documented less like bad luck and more like design. Margaret Hale came on a Saturday morning unannounced with her husband beside her. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and looked at Clara and said, "Tell me what you need." Clara told her. Margaret nodded once and said, "I can testify to what I saw at his supply house. I made deliveries there for 3 years. I saw things I didn't understand at the time." Her husband, a quiet man named George, who Clara had never spoken more than 5 words to, said, "So did I." That was the moment Clara felt something shift, not in the case, not in the documents, but in the valley itself. Like something that had been held under pressure for a long time was beginning very slowly to release. Albie Marsh came 2 days before the hearing in his good coat, nervous and formal, carrying a note from a records commissioner in Billings, who had responded to Crane's inquiry with a written statement confirming that Gerard Poole, the notary, whose stamp appeared on the coal transfer, had formally surrendered his commission in September of 1879, and had no legal authority to notarize any document after that date. Albie handed the note to Clara with both hands and said, "I looked it up myself too, after you came in. I didn't know what to do with what I found, so I wrote to Billings." He looked at her. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." "You're saying something now," Clara said. "That's what matters." The night before the hearing, Ethan sat on the porch after dark, and Clara sat beside him, and the valley was quiet in that particular heavy way of August nights in Montana, and the stars were out in their full summer abundance. "Tomorrow," Ethan said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Whatever happens, Ethan." "I know," he said. "I know, He stopped. "I've been carrying this alone for so long. It feels strange to know that tomorrow I won't be." She looked at him in the dark, at the profile she had come to know over 3 weeks of mornings and evenings, and lamplight and work. The jaw, the careful eyes, the scar curved like a question mark that was beginning to feel to her less like a question and more like an answer. "You won't be," she said. "Not tomorrow, not after." He turned to look at her then, and in the dark she couldn't see his expression fully, but she felt the quality of his attention, the way she'd learned to feel it completely present, completely honest, without anything held back. "Clara," he said, "I have to tell you something." "All right," she said. "I stopped on that road because of the horse," he said. "She went slow coming up on you, and I let her because she had better sense than me. If she'd moved past, I would have let us both go by." He paused. "I need you to know it almost didn't happen, that I almost kept riding." She looked at him for a long moment. "But you didn't," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." "Then that's the part that counts," she said. "The stopping, not the almost." He reached over and took her hand in the dark on the porch, in the last quiet, before the hearing that would determine whether everything they'd built in 3 weeks would be enough to stand against everything Whitmore had built in 30 years. His hand was warm and calloused and certain. She held it, and the night held them both, and the valley spread out dark and vast around the small, bright fact of it. The morning of August 4th came in hot and still. Clara was dressed before the sun cleared the hills. She had laid out her best dress the night before, dark blue cotton worn at the cuffs, but pressed clean and straight, and she stood at the small mirror in the barn loft and pinned her hair with the same deliberate steadiness she used when building a ledger column. One thing at a time, each piece in its right place. She heard Ethan moving in the house. The sound of the stove, the coffee, the particular rhythm of a man getting ready for the most important day of his life, while trying to make it look like any other morning. She went inside. He was at the table in his good shirt, dark clean collar buttoned, and he looked up when she came in, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been said on the porch the night before. She poured coffee and sat across from him, and they drank it, and the silence between them was the kind she had come to understand, was not absence but presence, the presence of two people who had gotten past the part where they needed to fill space with noise. Crane came out of the spare room with his satchel already buckled and said, "We leave in 20 minutes." And that was that. The ride to Willow Creek was the longest mile Clara had ever traveled. She had ridden it before in both directions, on foot and on horseback and on the back of a hay wagon. She knew every turn. But this morning, the familiar road felt different. Weighted, charged, the way air feels before a storm, when you can't yet see the clouds, but you can feel them coming in your bones. Ethan rode beside her. He did not look at her mostly. He watched the road ahead with the calm, steady eyes of a man who has made his decision and is no longer revisiting it. She found that easier to draw from than reassurance would have been. She didn't need to be told it would be all right. She needed to see someone who had decided to face it regardless. Willow Creek was already awake when they arrived. That was the first thing she noticed, the number of people out on the street at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday when ordinary business should have most of them inside. Word had gotten around. In a small town where Charles Whitmore had spent 30 years as the largest and loudest presence, the news that someone was challenging him in court had spread the way. Fire spreads in dry grass faster than anyone planned for, in directions that couldn't be fully controlled. Clara recognized faces as they rode up. Tom Briggs from the grain mill standing outside with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. The Alderman family. The woman who ran the laundry. Reverend Sykes near the church door, hat in hands, watching with the look of a man who has been praying about something and is now waiting to see how the prayer resolves. And at the far end of the street, near the courthouse steps, a group of ranchers she didn't recognize, older men. Weathered, the kind of faces that belonged to people who had been working this valley since before Whitmore arrived. They were talking among themselves in low voices, and they watched the three riders come up the main street with the particular attention of men who have a stake in the outcome. Ethan saw them. She saw him see them, and saw something move in his face. Surprise, and something beneath the surprise that she thought might be the specific, unfamiliar feeling of realizing you are not as alone as you believed yourself to be. "Who are they?" she asked low. "McKittrick," he said. "The tall one on the left. He lost his east pasture to Whitmore 6 years ago. The one beside him is Dawes. He lost his water rights. I don't know the others." "They came," Clara said. "They came," Ethan said, and his voice was quiet in a way that told her what it cost him to say it. "They tied their horses and went up the courthouse steps." The hearing room was not large. It held 2 long tables for counsel, a raised bench for the judge, a gallery of wooden chairs that was already more than half full when they walked in. Clara took her seat beside Crane and set her satchel of documents on the table and looked straight ahead. Whitmore was already at the opposite table. He had brought 2 lawyers, sharp men in city suits, one of whom Clara recognized from Billings, and one she didn't. He sat between them with the solid, unmoved bearing of a man who considered this proceeding a formality. His eyes found Clara the moment she sat down, and he held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and then he looked away, which was itself a statement. She looked away too. Back to her own table, her own documents, her own task. Crane leaned close and said very quietly, "Carpenter's been replaced." Clara went still. "What?" "The territorial court responded to the federal flag last night," Crane murmured. "Carpenter recused himself this morning voluntarily, which means someone told him to. The judge presiding today is Harrison Feld, out of Helena. I've appeared before him twice." "And," she said. "He's clean," Crane said. "Completely clean. Nobody owns him." A pause. "That's why there are so many people in the gallery. Word got out that Carpenter was gone." Clara processed this rapidly. Whitmore had come to this hearing Carpenter, expecting a judge whose discretion he had already purchased and whose rulings he had already arranged. He was sitting 10 feet away, believing he was in a familiar room, playing a familiar game on ground he had prepared. He was not. She felt the shift in the room at the same moment she saw it register faintly on Whitmore's face when Judge Harrison Feld came through the side door and took the bench. He was 60 compact with the brisk, no-ceremony manner of a man who had heard too many cases to be impressed by any of them. He settled his papers, adjusted his glasses, and looked at both tables with the measured, impartial eye of someone who had genuinely not made up his mind yet. Whitmore leaned toward his lead lawyer and said something. The lawyer's response was brief and tight. Whitmore's expression did not change, but his hands folded on the table in front of him, pressed together slightly harder. Clara saw it, filed it, said nothing. "We'll come to order," Judge Feld said. Crane presented their challenge to the property transfer first. He was methodical and precise and entirely without drama, which was Clara had learned how cases were actually won. Not with speeches. With facts laid flat and clear in the right order so that a reasonable person reading them could only arrive at one conclusion. He walked Feld through the notary discrepancy step by step. The departure date, the stamp date, the filing date. He submitted the written statement from the Billings Records Commissioner, confirming Poole's surrendered commission. He submitted the original loan agreement alongside the transfer document with the signature lines placed in direct comparison. He then submitted Pullman's mining survey and the payment records from Western Land Partners that Clara had copied from Whitmore's accounts. Whitmore's lead lawyer objected to the survey as irrelevant. Feld overruled him with a single word and went back to reading. The room was very quiet. Then Crane said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness." He called Albie Marsh. Albie came to the stand in his good coat, blinking behind his spectacles, and told the truth in the careful rule-following way that he approached everything that the record as filed contained a notarization stamp from a man who had no legal authority to notarize anything on the date in question, and that he had confirmed this independently through correspondence with Billings, and that the county record had been filed with this discrepancy, and had not been flagged because no one had previously looked closely enough to catch it. Whitmore's lawyer cross-examined him sharply. Albie held up under it because Albie was not interpreting or inferring or advocating. He was describing what the record said and what the Billings correspondence confirmed, and that was not territory where cross-examination had much purchase. Crane called Margaret Hale next. She walked to the stand with her husband behind her in the gallery, and she folded her hands and looked at Judge Feld and said in a clear and steady voice that she had made deliveries to Whitmore's supply house for 3 years and had on multiple occasions observed payments being processed that did not appear in the standard account. Ledgers that the records she had seen and signed delivery confirmations against did not match what was declared in the public business filings she had later had occasion to review. She was not an accountant. She was a laundrywoman. She said what she had seen exactly, and only that, and she did not embellish it, and the not embellishing was what made it credible. Whitmore's lawyer tried to establish that she had a personal grievance against his client. She looked at the lawyer with the steady, unafraid eye of a woman who has decided that she is done being afraid, and said, "I had a professional relationship with Mr. Whitmore for 3 years. I have no grievance against him personally. I'm telling you what I saw in his place of business because it was true then, and it's true now." Crane called McKittrick next. The tall rancher who had lost his east pasture came to the stand and described in plain and direct language the process by which Whitmore had loaned him money, extended unusual patience on the repayment, and then called the loan at a moment calculated to be most damaging during a drought when no alternatives existed, and had presented transfer paperwork that McKittrick's own lawyer hired after the fact, and too late had described as structured to prevent a successful legal challenge. "Did your lawyer explain why the challenge would fail?" Crane asked. "He said the judge was unlikely to rule in my favor," McKittrick said. "He didn't say more than that, but I understood what he meant." A ripple moved through the gallery. Clara heard it, the specific collective sound of people hearing something confirmed that they had suspected for years but never said out loud. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Feld. Then Crane said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Clara Bennett." She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment Crane said, "Your testimony is going to be central to this case." She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything methodically, in the quiet hours, thinking through what she would be asked, and what she would say, and how she would say it. She walked to the stand and sat down and looked at Judge Feld, and then at Crane. And she breathed once slowly, and she was ready. Crane walked her through the supply house accounts. The inconsistency she had found. The Western Land Partners payments. The notebook she had kept. She answered each question with the precision of a woman who has spent 10 years learning to make records that cannot be disputed. And she did not look at Whitmore, and she did not rush, and she did not elaborate beyond what was asked. Then Crane said, "Miss Bennett, were you dismissed from employment with Mr. Whitmore's supply house on the morning of July 8th of this year?" "I was," she said. "And at that time, Mr. Whitmore publicly accused you of theft." "He did." "In front of a crowd of Willow Creek residents?" "In front of most of the town, yes." "Did you steal from him?" "No," she said. "Is it your understanding," Crane said carefully, "that the dismissal and the public accusation were connected to the questions you had begun asking about the account discrepancies?" "It is my understanding," she said, "that Mr. Whitmore is a man who removes problems before they become larger problems. I had found something I wasn't supposed to find. The dismissal and the accusation were designed to ensure that if I later said anything, I would already be established as untrustworthy." She paused. "It was efficient, I'll give him that." A sound from the gallery, not quite laughter, not quite not laughter. Something in between the sound of tension releasing through a small opening. Feld did not look up from his notes. "Continue, Mr. Crane." Crane sat down. Whitmore's lead lawyer stood. He was good. Clara had expected him to be good, and he was precise, controlled with the practiced rhythm of someone who had cross-examined hundreds of witnesses and knew exactly where the soft spots usually were. He went after the notebook first, the copies she had made. He suggested she had altered them. She invited him to compare them to Whitmore's original account books, which were, as she noted, levelly available in his client's supply house if his client chose to produce them. He moved to her background. The lack of formal education. The moving from town to town. He implied, without quite stating, that a woman of her circumstances and history was not a credible source on complex financial matters. "Miss Bennett," he said, "you have no formal training in accounting, is that correct?" "That's correct," she said. "You taught yourself." "I did. From books. And from 10 years of doing the work," she said. "Under accountants and foremen and business owners who relied on the accuracy of what I produced. I have never once been dismissed for an error in my records." She paused. "Only for finding errors in someone else's." Another sound from the gallery. He tried one more angle. "Isn't it possible," he said, "that your emotional attachment to Mr. Cole's situation, given your current living arrangement at his property, has influenced your interpretation of these documents?" Clara looked at him steadily. "The notary left the county in September of 1879, she said. "His stamp appears on a document dated November of 1879. That is a fact that exists in the county record. It existed before I came to Willow Creek, before I ever heard of Ethan Cole, and before I had any reason to look at it. My emotional state does not change the date on a stamp." She paused. "Does it?" It was not a question. He heard it as the statement it was. He sat down. Feld spent 40 minutes reading through the documents. The room was so quiet that Clara could hear the man 2 seats down from her in the gallery breathing. She sat at the counsel table with her hands flat on her notebook, and she did not move, and she did not look at Whitmore, and she breathed slow and steady, the way she had taught herself to breathe when everything depended on staying calm. Ethan sat behind her in the gallery. She could not see him, but she could feel the particular quality of his stillness. The same stillness she had come to know from late nights at the kitchen table and early mornings on the porch. The stillness of a man who has made his decision and is holding it. Feld looked up. "I find the notarization on the 1879 transfer document to be invalid," he said. "The certifying notary had no legal authority on the dates in question. The transfer is therefore procedurally void and cannot stand as filed." He set his pen down. "The lien filed against the Cole property in connection with the alleged debt is dismissed as it was predicated on the disputed transfer." The gallery erupted, not loudly. This was a courtroom, and most of the people in it were ranchers and laundry women and grain mill workers who had been raised to show respect in formal settings. But the sound that moved through the room was real, and it was large, and it was the sound of something breaking open that had been held closed for a long time. Clara sat completely still. She heard it. She felt it. She kept her hands flat on the notebook and breathed. Feld was not finished. Regarding the broader allegations of fraud and conspiracy involving the Western Land Partners payment records, he continued over the fading sound of the gallery. I am referring this matter to the Territorial Court in Helena with a recommendation for a full investigation. The evidence presented today is sufficient to support that referral. He looked directly at Whitmore's table. Mr. Whitmore, I would strongly advise you to consult your legal counsel about your position going forward. Whitmore said nothing. His face was the face of a man who is performing composure with the same theatrical precision. He performed everything else, and it was very good, and Clara could see from where she sat the specific fine tension at the corners of his mouth that told her the performance was costing him more than usual. His lead lawyer leaned close and spoke quietly. Whitmore nodded once. And then, in a move Clara had not expected, had not prepared for, had not let herself anticipate, because anticipating things that might not happen was how you got knocked sideways when they didn't. Whitmore stood up. He buttoned his coat. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, not in anger, not in haste, with the measured, deliberate step of a man who is choosing to exit rather than be escorted out, which was the last form of dignity available to him, and he took it because he was nothing if not strategic about appearances, even at the end. The door swung shut behind him. The room breathed. Crane was already gathering documents. Clara turned in her seat and found Ethan directly behind her, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Open, unguarded, the full, undefended version of something he'd been keeping careful for 4 years. She stood up. He stood up. They were very close in the crowded space between the table and the gallery. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. And then, because there were a great many people around them, and this was a courtroom, and neither of them were the kind of people who made large public gestures, he simply reached over and took her hand, the way he'd taken it on the porch the night before. Quiet, certain, without asking, and she held it, and that was enough, and it was everything. McKittrick reached Ethan before they made it to the door. The tall rancher gripped his hand and said something low that Clara didn't hear, and Ethan nodded, and the look on his face when he turned back to her told her it had been the kind of thing that's hard to hear, because it's the kind of thing you needed to hear and didn't know it until someone said it. Dowse clapped him on the shoulder. 2 other ranchers, she didn't know the names of, said things she couldn't quite catch in the noise. Albie Marsh found her near the door and said with the earnest formality of a young man doing his best, "Miss Bennett, I'm glad it worked out." And she shook his hand and told him that what he'd done mattered, and she meant every word. Margaret Hale was waiting on the courthouse steps. When she saw Clara come through the door, she crossed the space between them and put her arms around her briefly and fiercely, in the way of women who have known each other through difficult things and don't need to explain what the embrace means. "I told you," Margaret said when she stepped back. "I knew." "You did," Clara said. "And you said so when it counted." Margaret's husband. George put his hand out, and Clara shook it, and he said, "Good work, ma'am," with the simple sincerity of a man who doesn't say many things and means all of them. Crane appeared at her elbow with his satchel buckled and his coat on, already in the mode of a man who has concluded one matter and is thinking about the next. "The Helena paper will want a statement," he said. "I'd suggest you let me handle it. You've done enough talking today." "Gratefully," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those sharp gray eyes. "Miss Bennett, I've worked with a great many people who were trying to prove something that was true. You are among the 2 or 3 best I've encountered." It was a professional compliment from a professional man, and she received it as such. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank Ethan," Crane said. "He's the one who sent the wire." I walked down the steps and mounted his horse and rode toward Miller's Crossing, and Clara watched him go, and then turned to find Ethan standing beside her in the morning sun, hat in hand, looking out at the street where Willow Creek was going about the business of understanding that something had changed. "What happens now?" she asked. Not anxiously, just asking. "Now," he said. "We go home." The word home sat between them for a moment, warm and specific, carrying the weight of everything it had come to mean over 4 weeks and a long fight. "The east pasture," she said. "The portion Whitmore took, with the creek through it." "The court will have to determine the restoration," Ethan said. "Crane says it may take months. There may be additional hearings." "But it will come back," she said. "Yes," he said. "It will come back." She thought about that. About the creek she hadn't seen yet. About the grazing land that would change the margins on those books from marginal to real. About what the coal meant not as a windfall, but as a choice. About the kind of people who chose carefully what to do with unexpected fortune, and the kind who let fortune choose for them. "What will you do," she said, "with the mineral rights, when the railroad comes properly?" Howe was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. "I haven't decided entirely," he said. "But I know I won't sell the land itself. My parents built it from nothing. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not going to let it become something other than what it was always meant to be." "A ranch," she said. "A home," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'd like to put a proper floor in the barn loft," he said then, with the abrupt practicality that she had come to understand was how he handled moments that felt too large to address directly. "It's not a decent room the way it is. If someone's going to live in it, it ought to be decent." "I wasn't planning to live in the barn loft forever," Clara said. He looked at her sideways. No, she said. "I was planning to renegotiate my living arrangements at some point, when the timing seemed right." "And when's the timing right?" he said. She considered him for a moment, the scar, the careful eyes, the jaw that was no longer quite as controlled as it was the first day, because 3 weeks of shared meals and late nights and one barn fire and a courtroom had done what time and shared work always does to the careful distances people keep. "Ask me properly," she said, "and I'll tell you." He turned to face her fully then on the courthouse steps in the middle of Willow Creek's Main Street, with half the town watching with varying degrees of pretending not to, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded expression she had first seen in the courtroom, the one that had no performance in it anywhere. "Clara Bennett," he said, "will you stay?" She let the question sit for exactly 1 moment. Let herself feel the full weight of it, not just what he was asking, but everything that had brought them both to this step on this morning in this town that had once watched her walk away with 30 cents and a satchel and nowhere to go. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." He put his hat back on. She picked up her satchel. They walked down the courthouse steps together and crossed the street toward the horses, and the town watched, and the morning was hot and bright, and the summer was almost gone, and neither of them said another word for a while, because neither of them needed to. The months that followed were not easy. Nothing real ever is. The restoration process moved through the territorial court with the grinding, unhurried pace of legal machinery. And there were weeks when Crane's letters brought news that required patience. Clara had to deliberately refuel, and weeks when the ranch work piled up faster than 2 people could address it, and weeks when the weight of everything that was still unresolved sat on both of them, in ways that were sometimes hard to carry gracefully. Whitmore's federal case moved forward through the fall. He had resources and lawyers enough to slow it, but not as it turned out to stop it. The Helena paper ran the story in September. The Territorial Railroad, presented with documented evidence of the conspiracy, quietly severed their relationship with Western land partners and cooperated with the investigation in the way that large institutions cooperate when cooperation is cheaper than the alternative. Thomas Hartley left Willow Creek in October. Nobody said much about where he went. The East pasture came back in November, transferred by court order. The deed restored to Ethan Cole without conditions. He rode out to see the creek the morning after the paperwork was signed, and he came back that evening and sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. And Clara did not ask what he had felt standing at that creek on land his father had worked, because she already knew, and knowing was enough. What she did not know yet, what she was still learning that winter slowly and carefully, and with the specific patience of someone who has spent a long time believing that things could not last, was how to let something good be simply good. How to stop looking for the edge where it ended. How to live inside a life, rather than alongside it. Braced for the moment, it disappeared. Ethan knew somehow without her telling him. He was not a man who used many words for the interior things, but he was a man who showed up at the table in the work. In the quiet of early mornings when the fire was just built, and the coffee was just hot, and there was nowhere to be yet. He showed up consistently and without ceremony, and that consistency was its own kind of language, and she learned to read it, and slowly, not all at once, but slowly, the way trust actually grows rather than the way it appears to grow in stories, she began to believe it. She wrote to Crane in January to ask whether her testimony and the account documentation had contributed materially to the fraud case. He wrote back to say that her notebook had been entered as primary evidence, and that without it, the Western Land Partners connection would have been significantly harder to establish. He also noted in the dry professional tone she had come to enjoy that the Billings Bar Association had formally censured Kellerman, and that Kellerman had surrendered his license the previous month. She read the letter twice, and then set it in the wooden box where she kept things that mattered between the Bible that had belonged to her mother and the first clean ledger she had started for the coal ranch, the one that now ran to 43 pages of clear, accurate accounts. She had given Willow Creek something it could not take back: a record of what had been done, and by whom, and what it had cost the people it was done to. That record would outlast her. It would outlast all of them. And there was a satisfaction in that, quieter and more durable than the satisfaction of the courtroom, but real in the way that things built to last are real. Spring came the way, Montana. Springs come abruptly, decisively, with a warmth that felt less like a change of season and more like a statement. On the first morning that felt genuinely warm, Clara stood at the kitchen garden and looked at what was coming up. The beans she'd planted in fall, the tomatoes she'd started on the window ledge, the section she'd put over to herbs that Ethan had looked at with polite skepticism and was now quietly enthusiastic about, and felt with a clarity that surprised her in its simplicity that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the fight was over, or because everything was resolved, or because the world outside had become any less complicated than it always was, but because she had built something here, not been given something, not survived to something. Built it with her own hands, and her own mind, and her own stubborn, patient refusal to accept that what other people decided about her worth was the same as what she was actually worth. Ethan came out of the barn and saw her standing there, and came to stand beside her, and they looked at the garden together in the early morning warmth, and after a while he said, "You're thinking." "I'm always thinking," she said. "Specific thinking," he said. "You've got a particular look." She glanced at him. "What look?" "The one you had when you went through the notary dates," he said. "Like you found the thing, and you're deciding what to do with it." She laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised her because it was uncomplicated. "I was thinking that I'm glad I collapsed against that fence." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad the horse slowed down," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it almost didn't happen." "But it did," he said. "It did," she said. "That's the part that counts." He reached over, same as he always did, without announcement, without asking, because he'd stopped needing to ask, and she'd stopped needing him to, and took her hand, and they stood there in the spring morning on the ranch that was theirs, that they had fought for and kept, that sat above a coal seam and a creek and 20 years of one family's work, and they watched the garden come up, and the day came up around them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a life, not the life that had been handed to either of them, because nothing real had ever been handed to either of them. The life they had built from what was left after everything else was taken, one careful day at a time. And in Willow Creek, Montana, in the year 1884. That was the kind of story people told their children. Not because it was easy, because it was true. Because it said the thing that people who have survived hard things most need to hear, that what you are is not decided by what is done to you. It is decided every single day by what you choose to do next. Clara Bennett had chosen, and she had built something that